Ever heard of Tangerine? It's this movie directed by a guy named Sean Baker. You may know him from The Florida Project, or Starlet, but probably The Florida Project. This film started getting huge buzz out of Sundance in 2015 based off the fact that it was all shot on an iPhone. However, you all know what class we're in, so you know that that's not the big talking point here. Tangerine is incredibly important because it uses hyperrealism to tackle an intersection that has rarely been explored: lower class and transgender. Hyperrealism was originally a concept taken from painting and sculpting. This has transitioned over to film in a relatively similar way, taking on the meaning of getting the film to seem synonymous with reality. Well, how does this film implement this properly? The starting point we have to look at is the main two characters, Cindy and Alexandra. These two are played respectively by Kiki Rodriguez and Maya Taylor. These two are the building blocks of the hyperreality this film builds, as even though this is something that should be a norm for casting directors everywhere, Baker actually cast two transgender women as transgender women, something that was very uncommon at the time. Looking at you, Eddie Redmayne. Not only that, but both of the women shared a lower level apartment in Los Angeles together, so the lower class and chemistry, as the two play best friends in the film, is also on point. In fact, in an interview with Maya Baker and Kiki, Baker states that every plot line in every detail came from stories told by these two women about things they had experienced personally. Anyways, you've heard enough backstory, time to move to the actual film. So, where do these two specific representational categories actively intersect within the plight of our two main characters? Well, the first point which these two play off of each other has to do with the bias they both face as sex workers. The first transaction we see is Alexandra attempting to give a handy to a pretty overweight guy for $40, even when Alexandra had previously set the price at $100. He ends up not getting hard and refuses to pay her, leading to an altercation between the two. It ends up happening in front of two police officers, and one asks the other if this is the first time they have dealt with Alexander. So, we can then assume this is something that has happened a multitude of times. Men not being able to get hard when being with Alexandra because of her being transgender and not giving her money. That affects her income and, even though it might seem a bit of a stretch, her class within the rank of sex workers, as Cindy constantly feels threatened by a slang term for girls on the block with vaginas. The interwoven clash of being transgender in class appears throughout the film in many different circumstances. For example, for the first half of the film, Alexandra is attempting to get people to come to her show where she is singing at a local bar. However, when her and Cindy are seen leaving the bar together, she slips a considerable amount of money into the owner's hand. Now, may I ask you, have you ever heard of a talent paying the venue owner? At the minimum, it is done for free, as they exchanges the performance for exposure. Now, I'm someone who doesn't like to jump to assumptions, but the logical conclusion is that this is a commentary on the very real issue of how mainstream Hollywood culture does not believe that someone who is transgender is marketable. This sort of discrimination and bias is something that is presumed to have stopped Alexandra from gaining more gigs and more following from said gigs to climb the ladder of the entertainment industry, thus putting up a barrier, making it unable for her to increase her income and in turn, her class. Finally, an important scene in this film that tackles these two characteristics is actually the final scene. Spoilers, after Cindy finds out that her fiance Chester cheated on her with Alexandra, she goes out attempting to draw in some clients. As she approaches a car, she has urine thrown in her face and transphobic slurs screamed at her as well. Alexander quickly rushes over to help her, and since they have no car and no money for a cab, or no money at all really, with Cindy only having $2 to her name, they walk over to the nearest laundromat, where both of them, at one point or another, take off their wigs, leaving them literally and metaphorically exposed in an incredibly vulnerable moment that really accentuates a hyper-realistic ending, as the two just sit there holding hands. I think that Baker really excels at taking these two factors and simply putting them in a real environment and observing how they interact with each other or how one affects the other. So, if you haven't already watched Tangerine, do it. It's an experience unlike any other, and if that isn't a movie to support, then I don't know what is.